What would you do if the only proof your father ever loved you went up in smoke on the parlor hearth, and the woman who lit the match smiled while it burned? In the village of Red Willow, 23-year-old Emma Mercer watched her stepmother feed her father's last will into the fire and claim the homestead as her own, leaving Emma with nothing but a black dress and a name no one would speak kindly. But what happened next? When Emma found a single overlooked letter with a folded map hidden inside, would undo every quiet cruelty done to her under that roof. Settle in, keep the lamp trimmed low, and let us know where you're watching from tonight. This story unfolds slowly, the way a truth long buried finally does. Rain had been falling on Red Willow for 3 days when Emma stepped down from the carrier's cart at the top of the lane. The driver did not look at her. He set her small case in the mud beside the gate, tipped his hat once, and drove on toward the market road, with his shoulders hunched against the weather. Emma stood a long moment, with her hand on the wet iron of the gatepost. The house at the end of the lane was the same house she had left at 17. Stone walls streaked dark with rain, slate roof sagging over the eastern gable, the chestnut tree by the kitchen door, older by 6 winters, and no kinder for it. She had come home because her father had died. She had come home too late to see him buried. The funeral was already over. The letter that summoned her had been sent late, delivered later, and by the time she reached the parish gate, the earth over her father's grave had been trodden smooth. Emma walked the muddy lane, with her case knocking against her knee and a grief in her chest so heavy she felt she was carrying 2 of everything. 2 lungs, 2 hearts, 2 sets of tired bones. At the door, her stepmother met her without embrace. Margaret Mercer was a tall woman, with pale eyes, and a mouth kept always slightly pressed, as though holding back a sum she meant to spend later. She looked Emma up and down in the doorway, and did not step aside for a full breath. "You took your time," Margaret said. "The letter came late," Emma murmured. "Come in, wipe your boots." Inside, the house smelled of coal smoke and something sharper beneath it. Vinegar, perhaps, or lye. Every small thing that had once been her mother's was gone from the mantel. The blue jug, the pewter candlestick, the framed sampler stitched with the 4 rivers of the parish. In their place stood a set of new brass ornaments Emma did not recognize, arranged with a stiff precision that felt more like a warning than a welcome. Her father's chair had been turned toward the window and pushed back a full pace from the hearth, as though someone had wanted him out of the way, even while he sat. Emma set her case down beside the settle and did not remove her coat. She slept that night in her old attic room under a thin blanket that smelled of storage. The rain kept on. Somewhere below her the clock struck 2, then 3. She did not weep. Weeping, she had learned in the years since leaving, was a thing one did in front of witnesses, and there were no witnesses here worth the tears. Morning came gray and low. Emma was down in the kitchen before the fire was properly awake, coaxing the coals with the poker her father had shaped himself, in the smith's forge the winter she was 10. She heard Margaret's tread on the stairs, and did not turn. Margaret came into the room, carrying a folded paper in one hand, and a taper in the other. She crossed to the hearth. She did not speak. She simply lowered the paper into the fire. Emma saw the seal before the flames took it. Her father's seal. Red wax cracked cleanly in half where someone had already opened it. And beneath the seal, a hand she knew better than her own. Her father's hand, his will. The paper curled, blackened, and lifted in a slow, bright twist up the chimney. "There," Margaret said. "That's done." "That was his will," Emma said. "That was a scrap." Margaret set the taper on the mantel with careful fingers. "The house is mine. The land is mine. He signed the deed over to me last spring. There is nothing here for you." Emma stared at the hearth. The ash was already gray. A corner of the seal, unburnt, sat curled among the coals like a bitten fingernail. She thought, quite clearly and without heat, that she should have known. That she had known. In some room of herself she kept locked. Her father had written to her every month for 6 years. And in the last letter, the one that reached her the week before news of his death, he had said only, "Come home when you can, child. There is something I want you to have." He had not named the thing. He had underlined the word have twice. "You'll take breakfast and go," Margaret said. "The weavers have a place for a girl who can scrub. I've spoken for you." "I'll not scrub for the weavers," Emma said. "You'll do as you're told." Emma did not answer. She rose, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked out into the wet yard without her coat. The chickens scattered before her. The chestnut tree dropped a slow, cold drop of water onto the nape of her neck. She stood at the corner of the barn where her father used to stand of an evening with his pipe, and she looked out across the low, sodden fields toward the willow ridge that gave the village its name, and she thought, not in words, but in the deep bone place beneath words, that a paper and a fire was a small thing, and that her father had been a careful man, and that careful men do not sign away their daughters with only one page. She stayed in the yard until her sleeves were soaked through. Then she went back inside, climbed the attic stairs, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed with her hands folded flat in her lap. Would you have gone to scrub for the weavers? Would you have taken the coach out of red willow and left the ash where it lay? Or would you have stayed, quietly, and started to look? Tell us in the comments where you'd have stood, and if this story is holding you, leave a like and follow along. Because what Emma found next, tucked between the pages of a book her stepmother never thought to check, was the beginning of everything Margaret Mercer had tried to burn. That afternoon, the rain thinned to a fine gray drift, and Emma put on her coat and walked down into Red Willow proper. She meant to speak to the parish clerk. She meant to ask, plainly, whether a deed had been lodged in the spring, and by whose hand, and with what witnesses. She had no plan beyond the asking. She had only the certainty, small and stubborn as a stone in a boot, that her father had not gone quietly out of the world without leaving something behind for her. The lane between the hedgerows was rutted with cart tracks and running with brown water. She kept to the verge. When she came in past the smithy and the grain store, the village was already at its afternoon business, and she felt the eyes lift from doorways as she passed. A woman at the pump nudged another. A boy stopped his stick and stared. In the window of the drapers, the curtain twitched and settled. She heard the first of it outside the baker's. "That's the Mercer girl," a voice said, low, "not meant to carry, and carrying anyway. Come back for the picking." 6 years and not a letter to her father's grave. Margaret'll set her right. Emma did not turn her head. She had learned, in the 6 years away, that a face kept forward could carry more than a face turned to answer. She walked on to the parish office. The door was locked. A card in the window said the clerk was gone to Bridewell until Thursday. She stood a moment, with her hand on the cold iron latch, and then she turned back into the square, and there was Margaret. Margaret Mercer stood outside the grocer's, with a basket on her arm, and 2 of the village wives beside her. And when she saw Emma, she smiled, not warmly, but broadly, so that the wives should see it. "Emma," she said, loud enough for the square, "come and greet Mrs. Hollis. She's been kind enough to ask after you." Emma crossed. She nodded to Mrs. Hollis. Mrs. Hollis nodded back, with a face like a shut drawer. "I was telling them," Margaret said, "how you've come home to help. The weavers will have you Monday. It's a good place for a girl in your circumstance. Better than she deserves, some would say, after so long gone." "I've not agreed to the weavers," Emma said. Margaret laughed. It was a bright, hard laugh, pitched for the wives. Listen to her. Not a shilling to her name. And particular. She turned to Mrs. Hollis. Her father spoiled her. I've said so 100 times. Emma did not answer. She stepped back from the small circle and walked on across the square, and she felt the laughter close behind her like a second coat. At the corner by the churchyard wall, an old woman was sitting on the low stone bench where the pallbearers rested. She was wrapped in a black shawl and a black bonnet, and her hands were folded over a stick. Emma knew her, dimly. She had been the sexton's wife in the years before Emma left, and was a widow now, and older than any single person in Red Willow ought to be. Her name was Mrs. Ashe. Emma slowed. She meant to pass with a nod, but the old woman's head came up, and her eyes, pale and unclouded, fixed on Emma with a steadiness that stopped her. "Child," Mrs. Ashe said. "Mrs. Ashe." The old woman studied her a long moment. Then she said, quite quietly, "Your father hid what he loved, where he knew it would be looked for last." Emma waited. She thought there would be more. There was not. Mrs. Ashe lowered her eyes to her stick and folded her hands over it again, and the moment closed like a door drawn to. Emma walked home along the willow ridge, and she turned the sentence over in her mind all the way, and could make nothing of it. She reached the gate as the light was going out of the sky. The rain had stopped. A thin, milky band lay above the western fields where the sun had been, and the slate of the roof shone dully, like the back of a wet fish. The chestnut tree stood black and dripping. Somewhere behind the barn, a dog barked once and was quiet. Inside, Margaret had gone out. The kitchen was empty and cold. A cup and a plate sat unwashed on the deal table, and the fire was down to a red eye. Emma did not light a candle at first. She stood in the passage and listened to the house. It was not the house she had left. That was what she understood, standing there in her wet coat with her hand still on the latch. The bones of it were the same low beam over the parlor door, the same slight give in the third stair, the same smell of coal and old timber under the newer smell of vinegar. But the arrangement of it had shifted, room by room, in the way a face shifts when the person behind it has become someone else. Chairs stood at wrong angles. A rug, she remembered, was gone from the parlor floor. Her mother's things were not merely put away, they had been erased, and the erasure had been done carefully. She went at last into her father's small back room, the one he had called his study, though it was scarcely larger than a pantry. She lit the stub of candle on the sill. The room was almost bare. His desk had been cleared. The drawer of the desk stood open and empty. The shelves that had held his ledgers and his letterbox and his prayer book were nearly empty too. Only a row of old volumes remained on the lowest shelf. A farmer's almanac, 2 bound years of a parish magazine, a battered book on grafting fruit trees, and, at the end, the family Bible, with its cracked leather spine. Emma sat down in his chair. The seat still held, faintly, the shape of him. She put her hand flat on the desk where his hand had rested 1,000 evenings, and closed her eyes. She did not weep. She had done her weeping on the coach. After a long while she rose, took the candle, and went upstairs. She did not go to the attic. She carried her blanket down and laid it on the narrow horsehair sofa in the study. And she lay down there in her clothes, with her coat over her. And she meant to keep watch on the room, though she could not have said for what. The candle burned down and drowned itself in its own wax. The house settled around her, board by board. Somewhere in the eaves a mouse worked at something small and dry. Emma listened. She listened for her father's step, though she knew it would not come. She listened for the shape of what he had left behind, though she did not yet know its name. Outside, the wind rose in the chestnut tree, and a single branch tapped, once, twice, against the study window, as if asking to be let in. She lay very still under the coat and let the tapping happen. Once, twice. A pause. Once again. It was only the wind. She knew the chestnut. She knew which limb reached the study window and which cleared the eave. And yet the sound came at an interval too, even for weather. 3 taps. A rest. 3 taps. And something in Emma's chest, half asleep, went quiet, the way an animal goes quiet before it turns its head. She opened her eyes to the dark. The room held the same shapes it had held an hour before. The desk, the bare shelves, the row of old volumes on the lowest board. She let her gaze rest on that row without meaning to, and the small thing that had been trying to be noticed since she first lit the candle finally arranged itself in her mind. The books were in the wrong order. Her father had kept them by height, tallest at the left, shortest at the right, in the way a man keeps a hedge trimmed on habit alone. She had watched him restore that line 100 times over her girlhood, sliding the almanac an inch to correct it, tapping the parish magazines flush with the shelf edge with the flat of his thumb. Tonight the family Bible sat at the end, cracked spine outward, but the almanac had been shoved between the 2 bound years of magazine, and the grafting book leaned drunkenly against nothing at all. Someone had taken the books down and put them back, without knowing the shape of them. Emma did not get up. She lay in the cold study and let the knowledge settle. Whoever had cleared the desk and emptied the drawer had touched those books too. They had lifted each one, opened it, shaken it perhaps, and returned it to the shelf without care, and they had put them back, which meant they had found nothing, or they had believed they had found nothing. She thought of Mrs. Ashe on the low stone bench in her black shawl and her black bonnet, her hands folded over her stick. Your father hid what he loved, where he knew it would be looked for last. Emma turned the sentence in the dark, the way a woman turns a key that will not fit, testing it against the shape of the lock. Looked for last, not hidden last, looked for last. Outside, the branch tapped again. Once, twice. Then the wind moved elsewhere, and the room was only the room. Emma did not rise to the shelf. She would not fumble at it by feel in the dark, with the candle drowned and Margaret liable to come back through the kitchen door at any hour. She lay under her coat and watched the square of the window turn from black to iron, and from iron to the pale gray of a country morning. When the light was strong enough to show her hands, she got up. She smoothed the blanket. She folded her coat over the back of the chair. She looked once at the row of books, at the Bible at the end, with its cracked leather spine, and she left the study and went into the kitchen and set about the fire, because Margaret would want her tea, and Emma did not yet wish to be asked what she had been doing in the study all night. She fed the coals with the poker her father had beaten out of a length of scrap in the smith's forge the winter she was 10. The iron warmed under her palm. She waited. By 8 o'clock, Margaret had taken her tea and gone out again with the basket, saying she would be at the weaver's by noon, and expected Emma to think on her circumstance. Emma said nothing. She rinsed the cup and the plate. She stood a moment at the window, watching Margaret's back move down the lane, and when the black bonnet had passed the chestnut, and the hedgerow closed behind it, Emma turned and put her hands to the work she had been given by the tapping of a branch. She began with the study. She did not touch the books. She wanted the room clean before she read them, the way her father had wanted a plow clean before he set it in the shed. She swept the boards. She wiped the sill where the candle had drowned and scraped the wax up with a knife. She rubbed the desk with a cloth wrung out in vinegar and warm water until the wood showed its old grain, walnut, with a scar near the edge where a boy or a dog had once bitten it. The poker leant against the wall inside the door where she had set it down, and every time she passed, she laid her hand on its warm handle, without thinking, as if greeting an old dog by the ear. The old dog, in fact, was under the sofa. She had not known it was there until it sighed. A low, brindled bitch, gray about the muzzle, ribs showing through a coat that wanted brushing. Emma knelt. The dog lifted its head and put its jaw on her boot without rising. It was her father's dog, then. Margaret had not put it down, but had not fed it much either. Emma fetched a heel of bread and a little dripping and set it on a saucer, and the dog ate slowly, with dignity, the way old things eat. She named it nothing. She only said, "There now," and the dog thumped its tail once against the boards. After that, the dog followed her from room to room. Emma went at the parlor next, where the rug was missing, and the chairs stood at wrong angles. She moved the chairs back to the marks their legs had pressed in the boards over years. The marks were still there, under a film of grit. The chairs had been shifted only weeks. She brushed the hearth. Behind the grate, she found a curl of paper edge, blackened, no bigger than a thumbnail, and on it 3 letters in her father's hand, the tail of a word ending in Geej. She put it in her apron pocket without looking at it long. She scrubbed the deal table in the kitchen. She swept the passage. She carried out 3 pails of gray water to the yard and threw them into the drain by the chestnut. The dog came with her and stood by the gate and looked down the lane. Emma looked with her. The lane was empty. She went into the barn next and found her father's tools hung as he had hung them, in the order of their use, the smallest to the left. Only 2 hooks were bare. She noted which and passed on. By the middle of the afternoon, Emma's hands were red to the wrist, and her back ached along the belt of her dress. She had learned the house through her palms. She had learned that Margaret had emptied the desk and the shelves, and the letterbox and the mantel, but had not lifted the loose brick behind the copper in the scullery, which Emma's father had used as a boy to hide marbles from his brothers, and which held now only dust. She had learned that the 3rd stair still gave, under the weight of a foot, and that the give had been widened, as if the tread had been prized up and set back down not quite square. She did not lift it, not yet. She stood in the study at last, with the poker in her hand and the old dog at her knee, and looked at the row of books on the lowest shelf. The light through the window was low and yellow. The Bible sat at the end, with its cracked leather spine turned outward, patient, as it had sat every evening of her girlhood. Emma did not reach for it. She waited until her breath was steady. Then she knelt. She drew the Bible from the shelf with both hands, as one lifts a sleeping child, and set it on her father's clean desk. The leather was dry and cracked at the spine, and cold to the touch. The old brindled bitch lay down at her foot with a soft breath. Emma opened the front board. The end paper was foxed and brown at the edges. Her mother's name was written there in the corner, in a young, clear hand, and beneath it, in her father's hand, the words, "and hers after," undated. Emma turned that page and the next. The great family tree lay across the 2 center leaves, unfinished. The last names entered in a hand that trembled slightly at the loops. Her own name was there. Margaret's name was not. Emma turned the pages more slowly then. She went through the book of Ruth because her father had marked it once with a pencil line, and past the Psalms and into the Gospels. Between the last page of Malachi and the first page of Matthew, where the paper thickened for the binder's stitch, something checked her thumb. She parted the leaves. Folded flat and pressed, there was a letter. It had lain long enough to have taken the shape of the paper on either side of it. The wax was unbroken. The seal was red and small, and stamped with her father's initial. Emma sat back on her heels. The dog raised its head and lowered it again. She did not open the letter at once. She set it on the desk beside the Bible and looked at it. The candle stub was gone. She had cleaned it away in the morning. She lit a fresh piece from the kitchen, and brought it in, and set it in the tin holder on the sill. The light climbed up the paper, and showed her name across the front in her father's writing. Emma Mercer. Underneath, smaller, to be given into her own hand. Emma slid the blade of her sewing knife under the wax. The seal broke cleanly, and lay in 2 red halves on the desk. She unfolded the letter. There were 2 sheets. The first was a letter. The second, folded twice inside it, was a map. She read the letter first. Her father had written it in the autumn, 6 weeks before he died. He wrote as he had always written, in short sentences, as if he grudged the ink. "Child," he had written, "if this comes to your hand, it is because I could not put it there myself. The house is not what it was. I have not been well used in it. I have made another paper, besides the one that lies at the desk. I have lodged it, where a stranger will not think to look, and a wife will not stoop to. Follow the map. What is there is yours. It was always yours. Your mother and I put it by for you the year you were born, and I have added to it every good year since. Do not quarrel with her over the walls and the roof. Take what is yours, and go if you must. But know that you were loved in this house, while I had breath. Your father." Emma read it once, and then a second time, and then a third. She did not weep. The dog put its chin on her boot. She unfolded the map. It was drawn on the back of a leaf, torn from one of his ledgers, in his own careful pencil. She saw the shape of the yard, the barn, the chestnut, the low sodden fields, the willow ridge above the village. A dotted line went out from the kitchen door, past the drain, across the yard, through the gap in the hedge where the pigs had used to go, along the field edge, and up to the ridge. There, under the 3rd willow from the north end, he had drawn a small square, and printed one word beside it: stone. Emma folded the map along its old creases, and put it inside the letter, and the letter inside her bodice against her stays. She put the halves of the seal in her apron pocket, with the blackened curl of paper from the parlor hearth. She closed the Bible, and set it back at the end of the row with its cracked spine outward, as it had always sat. The wind rose while she was on her knees. She had not heard it come up. The chestnut branch tapped at the window 3 times, then 3 times again. The dog got to its feet and looked at the door. Emma heard the yard gate. She heard boots on the flags. She heard Margaret's voice raised outside, speaking to someone who did not answer. And then a man's voice, low and unfamiliar, and then Margaret again, sharper. Emma pinched out the candle with her wet fingers, and stood in the dark of the study, with her back to the desk. The dog pressed against her knee. Emma put her hand on its shoulder to keep it quiet. Margaret came in through the kitchen door, and did not go up the stairs. She went first to the parlor. Emma heard her lift the poker, and set it down again. She heard the scrape of a chair. Then Margaret's step came along the passage to the study. "Emma," Margaret said. She said it without opening the door. "Come out of my husband's room." Emma opened the door. Margaret stood in the passage with a wet shawl over her shoulders, and her pale eyes narrow. Behind her, in the kitchen, a man stood by the deal table, with his hat in his hand. He was thin, red about the cheeks from cold, in a black coat too light for the weather. Emma did not know him. Margaret did not name him. "This is Mr. Pettit," Margaret said. "He is from Bridewell. He has come about the deed." "On a Wednesday," Emma said. "On the day I asked him," said Margaret. "Sit down." Emma did not sit. Mr. Pettit did not sit either. He looked at Margaret and at Emma and at the wet floor, and he cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mercer has asked me," he said, "to draw a paper, transferring the tenancy of the room above the weaver's shop into your name, as her contribution to your settlement. She wishes it signed tonight." "There is no need of a settlement," Emma said. "There is every need," Margaret said. "You will sign it, or you will sleep in the barn." The wind flung a spatter of rain against the kitchen window. The fire under the kettle guttered. Emma felt the letter and the map warm against her stays. She felt the dog's shoulder against her knee. She thought of the willow ridge in the dark, and the third willow from the north end, and the small square drawn beside the word stone. She thought of her father writing, "Take what is yours, and go if you must." She thought of what he had also written, that she had been loved in this house while he had breath. She looked at Margaret and did not raise her voice. "I will not sign tonight," Emma said. "I will not sign tomorrow, and I will not sleep in the barn." Margaret's color rose. Mr. Pettit turned his hat in his hands. Outside, in the wet dark of the lane, another sound had risen under the wind, a thin cry that was not a bird and not a sheep. The dog's ears went up. Emma heard it too. She stepped past Margaret and past Mr. Pettit and lifted the latch of the kitchen door. A woman stood in the yard in the rain. She had a bundle held tight against her chest, and the bundle was crying, and the woman herself could scarcely stand. Emma did not know her. Emma opened the door wider and said, "Come in, out of the wet." The woman came in, and Emma shut the door behind her against the wind, and set her by the fire, and put the kettle across, and did not look at Margaret at all. The woman was called Hester, and she had walked from the far side of the willow ridge, because her husband had gone under a cart on the Bridewell Road, and her cousin's house had been shut against her. Emma gave her dry cloth, warm milk for the child, and the horsehair sofa in the study. Margaret stood in the passage and did not speak. Mr. Pettit put on his hat and said he would come again when the household was more settled, and went out into the rain. Margaret went upstairs. The stairs gave under her tread, and the third one gave more than the rest. Emma waited until the house was quiet. Then she took a lantern from the barn, a spade from the row of tools, and the old brindled bitch at her heel, and she went up along the field edge to the willow ridge in the wet dark. Under the third willow from the north end, she cleared away sodden leaves and turned back a slab of flat stone, the size of a hearth brick. Beneath it, wrapped in oiled linen inside a tin, was a second will, correctly witnessed by the smith and the former sexton, dated the March before her father died. A leather purse of sovereigns her father had put by since the year Emma was born. The deed to the 4 acres on the ridge itself, held in his own name and never signed over, and a folded copy of the transfer Margaret had claimed, unsigned, in her father's careful hand, with the word "refused" written across it and initialed. Emma carried the tin down the ridge under her coat. The parish clerk returned from Bridewell on Thursday. He read the second will at his desk in the parish office, took off his spectacles, wiped them, and put them on again. He said quietly, "This is in good order, Miss Mercer. Everything is here. You need do nothing hasty." He walked with her himself to the smith's forge, where the smith confirmed his mark, and then to the cottage of Mrs. Ashe, who confirmed her husband's. Word went along the lane by the pump before Emma had reached her own gate. By Saturday, villagers who had watched her from doorways were touching their hats at the churchyard wall. Mrs. Hollis brought a jar of honey to the kitchen door and said she had known Emma's father for a good man. The weavers sent no more word about the room above the shop. Hester stayed on and helped with the washing. The child slept in a drawer lined with wool by the study fire. Margaret sat a long time at the deal table, with the papers spread in front of her. She did not shout. She did not weep. She said, at last, "He was a careful man. I underjudged him." Emma did not answer that. Emma said only, "You may keep your own things. The brass on the mantel is yours. The rest we will settle by the clerk." Margaret gathered her basket and her shawl, and by the end of the week, she had gone to a sister in Bridewell, without a scene. The village noted her leaving without laughter. Outsiders came, as they do when a story turns. A land agent from the market town, a cousin nobody had seen in 20 years, a curate with a subscription book. Emma met them at the door with reddened hands, and turned most of them away kindly. The old bitch lay across the threshold and watched them go. Mrs. Ashe, on her stone bench, lifted her eyes from her stick when Emma passed and said, "I told you." Emma said, "You did." Mrs. Ashe lowered her eyes again, and that was the last time she spoke of it. By the end of the season, the slate on the eastern gable had been mended. The rug had come back to the parlor floor, from where Margaret had rolled it into the loft. The blue jug stood again, on the mantel between two brass ornaments Emma had let stay, and the chestnut tree by the kitchen door had shed its leaves onto a swept yard. Hester's child had learned to sit up on the horsehair sofa and to laugh at the dog. The 4 acres on the ridge were let to a young couple from the next parish, who wanted to try apples, and Emma walked up most evenings to see how the ground was breaking. On one such evening, in October, Emma stood at the gate at golden hour. The willows on the ridge were pale against a sky the color of weak tea and honey. Smoke rose thin and straight from her own chimney. The dog sat by her boot, with its ribs filled in, and its coat brushed to a low shine. Hester came out with a lamp not yet needed, and stood beside her without speaking. Somewhere down the lane a cart went by, and the driver lifted his hat. Emma looked at the house, and the tree, and the ridge, and said quietly, "He did not leave me a house. He left me a way to keep one." Hester nodded. The dog thumped its tail once against the stone. "Thank you for staying with Emma to the end of this quiet, hard-won road, for sitting through the rain and the ash and the long gray mornings until the light came back. If this story of patience rewarded moved you, leave a like, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe for the next tale of a widowed blacksmith's daughter and the locked coffer no one in her village would open. Until then, walk gently.